when Maria wrote to me with invitation to a conference entitled Palladas and the New Papyrus, I thought, wonderful. I want to speak about Palladas, about my critical edition of Palladas. I can talk about that for several hours, no problem. But Maria immediately answered, no. We would like you to talk about the New Papyrus. And I thought, well, this is more difficult because one can agree or can disagree to some extent with Kevin's conclusions about authorship and chronography and chronology. But from the point of view of the edition of the text, his book is, I think, impeccable. It is very difficult to find a parallel that he has not found. It is very difficult to suggest an interpretation that he has not suggested in the commentary. So I thought that it might be interesting to take a look, not to the papyrus, to the Yale book of Epigrams itself, but for the context of this book. I was interested in trying to determine the context, the geographical context, and the time frame for this book. What was being written in Upper Egypt in this time? What was being read in Upper Egypt at that time? You have this in the first point in the handout. You have here a map taken from Laura Miguel's book. Of course, you don't need it. You know very well where every Egyptian city is, but perhaps we can remember something. On top, you have our beloved Alexandria, the Delta Nile, the highly populated Lower Egypt, with all those places. You have El Fayum, Oxyrhynchus, from where almost every papyrus comes. And you have Upper Egypt. And this is the place that we are interested in. As you know, we don't know the provenience of this codex. Unfortunately, it has been acquired in the antiquarian market, and we have lost very precious information about its origin. If we could know where this papyrus was found, that would change a lot our discussion here. Well, we do not know where it was found. We do not know the archaeological context. This is a pity because it should not be the way papyrus are brought up, but unfortunately, that's the way it is. But we have some clues. I have printed here a paragraph by Babcock. I think this is almost a perfect paragraph of scholarship. Although it is not known where our codex was found, let alone where it was originally manufactured, internal evidence in the form of multiple references to Hermopolis will naturally raise the questions of whether the codex is from that city of region. Hermopolis, actually, Esmunane, about 500 kilometers in a straight line from Alexandria, 6 hours by car today, many days by donkey. If you do that in Palladas' time, about 500 kilometers, different cultural reality than Alexandria. Not so different, but different to some extent. Well, it must be emphasized that this is not a document. This reference in the poems, in the strictest sense, can only suggest that the poet itself can be familiar with the city. I stress this. Can only suggest that the poet himself has been familiar with the city. Not that this or any other manuscript of the work, if there is any other, is from that city, of course. But there is at least an a priori argument that poems about Hermopolis would be more popular in that city than elsewhere. And there is certainly no evidence that this collection of poems was widely circulated. We have no evidence to the contrary, but we have not a positive evidence about its circulation. So an aspect that is very striking and has been said many times about this book of epigrams is that it's very local in content. So local that we find references to cities that are not even in the maps of Skinepolis, for example, only references. And you really have to look hard to find in the Barrington Atlas Skinepolis. Huh? It's there, I assure you, but it's really hard to find. And there are some documents, but it's a place nobody talks about. But our poet has been there, or at least know that it's there. So the context is very local. The circulation of the book seems to have been not very wide. And our place, our geographical place, is Hermopolis and its surrounding area. Concerning time, well, this is a discussion that, of course, is far beyond my abilities. We have been talking yesterday about the chronology, but from the literary point of view, a generation is not much. So I have widened my search to more than reasonable limits, from about 200 to 400. It can be reduced, but the testimonies are not much, so I prefer to keep a wide perspective. On the second part of the handout, can you go down, please? You have some percentages, some figures, using this remarkable tool, the Leuven database of ancient books. I have tried to see what was going on in the Hermopolis area in this time. How many books do we have from this region? You have there the number of books, between literary books, between 200 and 400, approximately 70 from Hermopolis, approximately 150 from Antinopolis, 7 from Aphroditopolis, 25 from Panopolis. Panopolis is in the debate, but well, it's in the surroundings. None from Theopolis, Ptolemais, and Nicopolis, and in contrast, 600 from Oxyrhynchus. The total of books, literary and non-literary, and its distribution by centuries. As you can see, there is in Oxyrhynchus, there is a very known concentration of books in the 2nd and 3rd century. There, almost 40% of the books come from the 2nd century, and 33% come from the 3rd. And our testimonies for the 4th and the 5th are almost not existent. But in this region, in Hermopolis, the picture is very different. There is an increasing in the number of books. We know this has to be with the cultural situation. Literary books in point B, and their distribution by centuries, more or less the same picture. Poetry books on point C. This is not percentage, but the total number. We can see that Oxyrhynchus and its surroundings have a great concentration in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, but Hermopolis and the Tibet, there is a progression in the number of books in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th century. Take a look to the number of books we have from the 4th century in Hermopolis, poetry books, 29 to 51 in the 5th. I know this is not much, but is what we have. And finally, Homer. Homer should be everywhere as an indication of the reading of poetry. You can see that once again, Hermopolis has a progression in the number of texts, and Central Egypt, Middle Egypt, of Cyrenius, does not have that projection, and there is a dramatical change from 452 to 90 and to 59 and to 59. Well, this shows that the literary production and the literary reading in Hermopolis is somewhat different from that in Oxyrhynchus and from other places from which we have some testimonies. And now, I insist, this is not so much, but this is what we have. Well, I am going to talk about some texts that we know that come from Hermopolis with some confidence. We know they have been discovered in Hermopolis or the surrounding area. And I am going to concentrate on texts that seems to have written there in Hermopolis. It is very difficult to say where a text has been written. It is more or less easy to know where it was discovered, but where it was written is another different story. But I think this text can be of interest. Of course, I am not going to go through them in detail. You can use your train or plane trips for that. I am just interested in the great picture more than in the details. On point 3 of the handout, you have a very interesting text of which you have an image, not a very good image, but here it will be better on page 4 of the handout. This is a very interesting text that it has not been considered as it should. It is rotated, sorry. This is a single sheet of papyrus that contains a number of epigrams. It comes certainly from Hermopolis. There is some debate on the chronology and the datation of the text. The editrix Princeps, Teresa Lodi, thought that it was from the 3rd century, and that's the same opinion that Orsini has proposed in his recent catalog of the manuscripts in the Florentine libraries. Dorandi thinks that it comes from the beginning of the 5th century, or perhaps the end of the 4th century. In any case, it's more or less in our time frame. What is this? Well, this is one of the very few author copies we have from antiquity with variations. This is a draft, or it seems to be a draft. You can see that you have the points here. I'm sorry that it is rotated, but you can do this in your handout. There are some epigrams that are divided by long paragrapha. There are no headings, there are no titles, and at the end of the second of the verso of the papyrus, and interspersed in the verso, on the verso, there are some alternative readings or corrections. You can see them in the edition I have taken here. This is Page's edition. These variations are interesting, are not just pragmatic variations to fit a name or to adapt the poem to another use. These are, some are funerary epigrams, other are ekphrastic epigrams that maybe are supposed to accompany a picture, and they are supposed to be an homage to a certain Euprepius by his daughter. They suggest that the poems are not written by the daughter, but by a professional poet who was commissioned to do that. We can also think, of course, that it was some kind of stock material that was used for an inscription and was not even written there. But I think it's an interesting document of what could have been written in Hermopolis about this time. These are topical epigrams, that's true, in two of the most productive genera of the epigrams, funerary and ekphrastic. They have a practic objective, a practic aim. They're supposed to be used for something, as descriptions. Well, you can take a look to them later, and we can discuss them again later. I want to talk about other texts. On point 4 of your handouts, you have interesting rhetorical exercises from Hermopolis. These are no doubt from Hermopolis and from the 3rd and 4th century, as says Rosario Pintaldi, and they have been edited by Hyde. You know this book very well. This is a very interesting text, the first, is encomium. I don't have the picture here, but it's also a single sheet of papyrus with a poem on one side and another poem on the other side. This is the kind of poems that have been studied by Professor Cameron, for example, in which there is a poem, an introduction, in this case in iambics, and on the other side there is the hexametric poem that is introduced by the iambic poem. So it looks like, at least to me, it looks like an object prepared to be given to someone, prepared to be given to a recipient. You can see that there is not much remaining, but on the first on the recto, you can see some interesting things, as the use of a proverb as the last line. One swallow do not make a, how do we say here in English?
One swallow doesn't make a
That's right. And on the other side, we have an encomiastic poem with some words that are also found on inscriptions at this interesting Sauptolis, for example. It's a word used in encomiastic poetry. I have also printed here in very little type, you can read it, the description by Laura Migueles of these poems with a discussion of the contents. And the other one is an epithalamion, also for Hermopolis, also for the front century, second half of the 4th century, according to Page. And well, it's an epithalamion by its own nature. Epithalamion does not say much about the author, but where the description of Page is fair, a canto of epic words and phrases, whether suitable or not. We are talking here about poets that are in the limit of popular poetry and professional poetry, because this might be literary exercises for the schools or composed in the school. We do not know that. On point 5 of the handout, you have a poem from the Supplementum Hellenisticum. I am almost embarrassed to talk about this text before Professor Parsons, but well, it has been edited as an elegy, probably an elegy, It's a very interesting text. It's also a very interesting papyrus. It's a papyrus with a very wide margin. It may have been a luxurious book, or perhaps it has been also a single sheet of papyrus. We don't know that. And its genre is very interesting because it's a testimony of a kind of text known in late antiquity as BOE. This is a genre in which different choices or different alternatives in life are described. And there are many texts from late antiquity about this. There is a very good poem by Gregory of Nazianzus. There is one poem by Ausonius. There are two poems from the Epigrammata Bovensia, one by Julian of Egypt, one by Agathias, all of them talking about this period, about the different choices in life, about the different paths in life. All of them have a similar structure. And there is also a poem attributed to Positivus. I do not really think that this can be by Positivus, but well, is attributed in the mythology among many other people to Positivus. I have written an article on this. You can check all the points there if you want. This text is from Hermopolis, but if it's contemporary of the writing, it would be an example of this kind of poetry written there. If it is a Hellenistic text, of course, does not fit in this survey, and it's just a testimony of what was being read there. Nevertheless, the striking similarities that these texts have with all these poems by Gregory and onwards about the topic of the BOE incline me, just from a pure speculative and literary point of view, to consider it not a Hellenistic but a later text. Well, on point 6, you have the closest thing we have to a poetry collection. I know it's not the Bodmer Library, I'm sorry, but well, they all come from the same place, from Antinopolis, that's sure. They all are from about the same time, the 3rd and beginning of the 4th century. We don't know about its archaeological provenance. We don't know if they were together. We only know that they were excavated in the city, in some houses of the city. We don't even know if they were found in the same house. We don't know that. But it is interesting that all they come from here. Some epic fragments, some hexameters with lexicometry, some hexameters of elegiacs, poetry fragment with Scholia, quoted Antimachus, hexameters with Scholia and tragedy. So this may be the remains of a poetry collection, poetry library in Antinopolis in the 3rd and the 4th century, maybe. And the last text, this is not the last. This is a very complicated text. I have just mentioned it here for the sake of completeness. This is not found exactly in Apogee, but in Kelis. That is the oasis in the opposite side of the Great Desert. Kelis is a rather isolated place to know that some papyri and some wax tablets has been recovered there. And this is an interesting text. It has been suggested that they can be 2 epigrams. One, the first is variation of the Iliad, some scholarly, well, no, a school variation of the Iliad, and the second one, is a very interesting. satiric poem. The two parts do not fit very well. It has been suggested that perhaps we have two poems without graphical separation. Well, you can take a look to them. I have appended here the comment, extra synthesis, 1, 2nd, 5th, and 6th metra irregular in the 10th line, 4th metra irregular on the 11th and the 13th on the 14th. It's an interesting test. Perhaps a satiric epigram, and not exactly related with this place we're studying, Hermopolis, but perhaps close in the literary sense. And the last one I want to talk about is also a very interesting papyrus sheet that has been published by Lupe. I don't have the picture here, but you can see it in the edition in the archive for papyrus portion. This is the only collection of epigrams we have from Egypt, apart now for the Yale book of epigrams, between these centuries. The only one, but a very interesting one. The provenance of this papyrus is unknown. I have contacted the responsible of the Leipzig library to be sure, Professor Scholl. He told me that they have no information whatsoever about this papyrus. I was begging for him to say, yes, it comes from Hermopolis, but that didn't happen. It can come from Hermopolis, it can come from Opsirhynchus, it can come from everywhere. This is a very interesting collection, and this is very different to the one we have seen. This has headings, and Lupe thinks that the first is a erotic epigrams, Kypris and all that, but perhaps they're both Coptic epigrams. I will let that to the expert in Coptic poetry. You can see that there is also paragrapha and all these kind of things. Well, on the last page you have something like conclusion point. I have printed them here, so they can be read straight away. Let us now return to our starting point. In other words, to the Yale book of epigrams. How does it fit into all this? The first thing that springs to mind, simply by considering its format, is the remarkable nature of this codex, in spite of the state in which it has survived to this day. If it does indeed come from Hermopolis, it is the most extensive book of verse we have from this region from the 3rd and 4th centuries, without considering, of course, the magnificent volume of the Psalms you all know. How does it fit in with the literary practice in the region? In my opinion, it fits very paradoxically. On the one hand, it is hard to believe these epigrams were written in Hermopolis unless they are the work of a completely unknown author about whom we know nothing at all. None of the author mentioned by Photius in his codex, and of those of whose works nothing survives, seems to be a good candidate for the author of these epigrams. As you will remember, Photius describes a book in his library that contained the work of authors in Upper Egypt, authors from this very region, in the 3rd, 4th centuries. It is true that the authors mentioned as part of that codex are almost all epic and dramatic poets, but I still think that an author such as the one of these epigrams would have been mentioned. It is possible that a poet about whom we know nothing, like the author of the epigrams to Papyrus we saw on the point 3 of the epigrams, or the Lycic papyrus on the point 8 could be the author of these epigrams? I do consider it possible, albeit fairly unlikely. It may also be the case, of course, that the Yale Book of Epigrams was not written or copied in Hermopolis, but was taken there by a reader. We have well-documented cases of similar situations, such as the papyrus of encomiastic poems about the Ritus professor that Cavallo has proposed that was brought there by the market. Does all this reinforce the attribution to Palladas proposed by Kevin Wilkinson? Not necessarily. I think the metric and stylistic aspects of the epigrams in the Yale Codex are particularly close to those of Palladas, to the same extent as the epigrams by Ammianus and Nicarchus, for example, are to those of Lucilius, to give just an example. I think the epigrams on the Yale Papyrus are written in a genre that Palladas used for many of his epigrams, namely the Coptic epigrams, and even more importantly, using a tone that is very close to that of Palladas, as Ammianus and Nicarchus are to Lucilius. Yet even the epigrams by Palladas that were transmitted by the Greek anthology pose numerous problems of attribution. This is something I can personally vouch for, as I have already changed the structure of my critical edition of Palladas many times to reflect those issues. Even today, I am still not sure that all the epigrams featured in the anthology under the name of Palladas can be attributed to him, and I'm becoming increasingly convinced that the corpus of epigrams attributed to Palladas in the anthology is interspersed with poems by other authors. All said and done, it is hard to believe that no one else apart from Palladas and Gregory could have written epigrams in the 3rd and 4th centuries, especially considering that the genre enjoyed root health on inscriptions. We should remember, what's more, that the 2 epigrams preserved on the Yale Papyrus that have been preserved in the anthology have attribution issues. We all know that. One of them is anonymous in the manuscripts, and the other has a speculative title by the so-called corrector. This speculative title is very interesting. It should also be considered that we do not have any data, absolutely none at all, linking Palladas with Upper Egypt. Why would Palladas write a book of epigrams that refers so often and in such a detailed manner to the setting of Upper Egypt? This is a question I don't have an answer for. What on earth brought Palladas, we might ask, colloquially, to Hermopolis? No, it was not a real long trip, but it's not Alexandria. Well, we could think of a few things, but they would be bordering on pure fantasy, so I should end here, hoping that you will look kindly upon this brief survey with so few conclusions. The best conclusion I can offer is this paradox. This is a book with a markedly Upper Egyptian content, but it does not fit well in the literature being written there at that time. It seems more the work of another kind of poetry, an Alexander poet. But in that case, why does this talk about Upper Egypt in such a detailed manner? I have more questions than answers. Thank you.